agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Matheny. Hey, Kristen.
Hey, Mike. How are you? Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you, too. I'm looking forward to doing our first show together of 2020.
Yep.
But before we get to that, I just wanted to remind everyone that one of the things we're doing differently on the show in 2020 is accepting sponsors. And as I mentioned last week, this is something we did in the past, but we decided to stop doing it because, well, one, we didn't have enough say over who our sponsors would be. And secondly, we were contractually prohibited from offering Patreon supporters an ad-free option. But now we've dealt with both of those issues. So we're only going to be talking about products and services that we choose. And our Patreon supporters can get every episode of the show completely ad-free. And that includes no more of those breaks in the middle when I ask you to support the show on Patreon because, you already are. So all of that will be in your supporters only feed starting today. And with that little bit of housekeeping out of the way, Kristen, what is our top story for today?
Well, surprise, surprise. It's no surprise that it's Iran.
Yeah.
It pretty much dominated the news cycle this week. And, it's funny because we were just talking before the show, but I had a lot of trouble trying to figure out what the lens should be in terms of highlighting what's happened over the last week. How far back do I go? Do I give like a whole timeline? But you and Jay did such a good job of discussing it last week. And I feel like unless you've been under a rock, you probably know, what's been going on. Certainly listeners of our show know what's been going on, over the last few months, let alone for the last few decades. So, so I went back just a few weeks just to talk about a recap of everything that's happened leading up to this confrontation. So a lot has happened over the last week in terms of escalating tensions with Iran. And so I used the Associated Press because I think they're a pretty reliable source to go about creating just a really brief timeline. I love the Associated Press. So, they actually labeled it a confrontation. So that's the term I'm going to use. I think it's a pretty simple and probably the best description I've seen. So while there's been gradual buildup of both nations sort of blaming each other, there's been there's been a lot that's happened over the last couple of weeks. So I went back to December 27th, which is right after Christmas here in the United States. So a U.S. contractor was killed and several American and Iraqi troops are wounded in a rocket attack on a base in northern Iraq. And this largely went unnoticed because, it was the holidays and Congress was not in session and, there was a lot going on. So I feel like this sort of got buried for the most part. And the U.S. Blamed the attack on one of several Iran-backed militias operating in Iraq. And then on the 29th, a few days later, U.S. airstrikes hit militia positions in Iraq and Syria, and at least 25 were killed. And this is when Iran vowed revenge. So again, this went unnoticed too, but this was brewing, right after the holidays. So then on December 31st, hundreds of, and most people probably saw this because this did make the news, hundreds of Iran-backed militiamen and their supporters decided to storm the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. They were hurling rocks, they were breaking windows, threatening to kill those inside. And the U.S. Marine Guards who were outside responded to them with tear gas, and there were no casualties. So obviously it didn't end there. On January 3rd, a U.S. airstrike near Baghdad's international airport killed General Qasem Soleimani, who the AP and this is directly from the AP. I didn't want to conjecture this. They called him the leader of Iran's elite Quds force and the mastermind of its regional military interventions. And there was also somebody else killed, a senior commander of Iran-backed militias operating in Iraq. And then we sort of jump to what happened this week. So Iran announces it won't abide. This is on January 5th. Iran announces it won't abide by the nuclear deal. Consequently, Iraq's parliament holds a non-binding vote calling for the expulsion of all U.S. forces, which I looked that up. It was 5,000. It is 5,200 currently there. And Trump vows to sanction Iraq if the U.S. troops are expelled. And then we fast forward to earlier this week. Iran launches a flurry of ballistic missiles on 2 bases in Iraq where American troops are housed. In reported retaliation for Soleimani's death. There are no immediate reports of U.S. or Iraqi casualties, leading many to speculate whether the attack was just a show of strength, not actually aimed to spur the U.S. into a war. And Trump confirmed later that day that there were no casualties. And then, of course, we jump to later that same day. I was shocked. I don't know about you, but everyone was pretty much shocked when a Ukraine International Airlines plane crashed outside of Tehran on Wednesday morning, killing all 176 people on board. There were U.S., Canadian, and other intelligence sources confirmed that this was due to an Iranian missile. Among the victims were 63 Canadian nationals, 82 Iranians, as well as several passengers from European nations, Afghanistan, and Iran subsequently remained secretive, and they're still being pretty secretive, and cleared the crash site before the examiners from Boeing and from these nations were able to investigate. So that's sort of where we are now. On one last note, on Thursday, a very divided House, of course, voted to force Trump to come to Congress for authorization before taking further military action against Iran, which I figured that vote would pass. So that's sort of where we are, and it's moving hour by hour, day by day. What's your take, Mike?
Well, I'm glad to see that yesterday Iran actually admitted that, well, whoops, we inadvertently shot down that Ukrainian flight. I think if the evidence was so overwhelming, so that's good. And I want to give, I want to give President Trump credit, and that's not a phrase I use very often or lightly. I mean, I thought his response on this week was a careful, measured response, it sounded very un-Trumpian, I guess, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I agree.
Because I was concerned because, of course, earlier in the week, he said, well, you know what, we'll consider, we might actually target some of their cultural sites, which, of course, would be a war crime. And then, Mike Pompeo says, we wouldn't do that. And then the president says, no, actually, we would because of it. So that apparently has gone by, which is a good thing. And I think Jay last week said only time will tell, and I still think that's true because a lot of people, I think, are looking at Iran's attack, which clearly was not designed to do anything but just be a kind of a show, a face-saving show.
Yeah.
There were no casualties, and from what we know about Iran's missile program, they have the capability to inflict casualties, but they chose not to, and they had some ridiculousness for their domestic audience about all the scores of Americans they killed. And if that's all there is to it, then great. Donald Trump can dislocate his shoulder patting himself on the back, but I don't think that's all there is to it. I think most people don't. I think Iran was smart not to blindly strike back. There's no question that Soleimani was hugely important to them. And so if they want to strike back, it's going to take some time for them to do some real damage because they know in a head-to-head confrontation that there's no way they can go up against the United States. So we won't know, I don't think, the implications of this action that President Trump chose to take for maybe for years. And as I said last week, I hope he's right about this. And as Jay said last week, only time will tell. But I think we need to think about this in terms of what exactly our goals are here. And something that a lot of folks on both the left and the right, I think, correctly fault President Trump for is not necessarily being much of a strategic thinker. And it seems to me that our goals there are at least 4 goals, I think. And you can, let me know if I'm missing anything here, Kristen. But number 1, we want to prevent a war in the Middle East. I think we all can agree on that, right?
Yeah. Amen.
Number 2, we want to keep Iran from becoming a nuclear power as to the extent that that's possible. Number 3, we want, and this is sort of a blue sky goal, we want a stable democratic region with countries that have respect for basic human rights. Although I think President Trump is more a fan of the stable part than necessarily democratic or respect for basic human rights, given everything with Saudi Arabia and other folks. I don't know that he cares a whole lot about that? I don't know. And then finally, and this is a goal certainly that President Trump has that other people may quibble with or just disagree with, is getting our troops out of the Middle East and having our NATO allies take up more of the load, something the president's been pushing for, and a lot of other people question. And I'm one of those people who question that. So would you say that those are, at least those first three things, are widely shared goals, and then the fourth thing is sort of a depending on who you are kind of goal? Those are our main strategic goals there in the region?
I would, but I would maybe put a little asterisk next to the third goal, which was a stable democratic region. And I know this is something I would like that too. I think if we had a perfect world, and if we had all of the resources available to us, and things were going just as we wanted it to, I think that would be a wonderful goal. The problem is I just don't think that goal is completely feasible. And I do think that stability could be possible. I don't know that it's likely. As for, something that reflects a democratic system, I think that might be out of the question. Although I think that's what all of us would want on the right, on the left. I think that's what all of us would look towards in the future. One thing that I know we've talked about on this show before, you and I, is we've talked about, and I know I've brought up the fact that there are a lot of military higher ups and a lot of generals and a lot of people who, make studying conflict in the Middle East and war in the Middle East and Middle Eastern culture their life goal. And a lot of them have said that they also don't think it's possible, just because our cultures and where we come from, our histories, our backgrounds are so fundamentally different. And so, while I think that these are good goals, I love the first two. I think that they are workable and doable. And I agree. I love the third goal. I love, the fact that maybe someday, or just this, pipe dream, that maybe someday we'd be able to look to the Middle East and see a lot of stability and a democratic type of, some form of a democracy over there, or democratic countries. I don't know how feasible that is.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetimes.
No.
But as for that second goal, keeping Iran from becoming a nuclear power. Now, here's how I see this right now. If I'm looking at this from Iran's perspective, I see a president who is clearly comfortable with escalating, right? Doing something that previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican, chose not to do, killing Soleimani. And I also hear a president who, even if it's just on Twitter or in some Fox News interview, saying, hey, if they want to mess with us, we will take out their cultural sites. That's an option we will keep open, war crime or not. Then I'm thinking to myself, well, what's my insurance against this? Given the fact that there's no way that I can compete in a conventional war with the United States. Well, to me, my only insurance is making darn sure that I have a nuclear deterrent. And so, if anything, I would think that pushing matters might make Iran a lot more likely to develop these weapons. And certainly that seems as you mentioned in your recap, that's what Iran seems to have decided its own self. So I wonder if, what we're doing here is perhaps not working in our best interest.
I don't know that we found something that does work in our best interest when it comes to Iran. I was trying to think of, when I was, writing this timeline, I was trying to think of something that this reminded me of. And the only thing I could think of was, I probably have brought this up on the show. I bring this up about a lot of situations, but the Butter Battle book, Dr. Seuss's Butter Battle book, where, there are two people and they're on top of this wall that's built between these two sides, and, they're ready to drop the bomb on either side. And the book ends, if you've not read the book, or if you haven't read it in a long time, you should, but it just sort of ends with this big question mark, what's going to happen? And it was, of course, written about the Cold War, but I think it's applicable here. We're sort of on this precipice again, which is, a kind of a depressing thought, where we don't know what's going to happen. I think that what we've done in the past hasn't worked. And, when I think about what's been done, you brought up other administrations. I think to put the blame solely on Trump is short-sighted. And not that you've done this, but I've heard this done all over. I watch every news channel. I try to listen to everything, and I feel like a lot of people have put the blame squarely on Trump. Yes, he is a reactionary president, and yes, he does operate from a place of emotion rather than strategy and thought. I mean, I think we can all agree. But this is something that's been slowly escalating for a long time. I mean, how many people were killed by drones under the Obama administration? I feel like this has been ramping up since in my lifetime. I remember, this is kind of a repeat in a lot of ways of what happened when I was in grade school in the 90s in Iraq. But with different circumstances and different history. So, I think obviously, removing Iran's nuclear capability is important, but the big question is, how do we go about doing that successfully in a way that I don't think that we can do this without either harming the United States making concessions, or, our allies making concessions, or Iran making concessions. But then, like you said, this week we sort of reached this fever pitch where, Iran was lobbing these ballistic missiles at Iraqi air bases in an attempt to, at least look like they were trying to kill Americans, or look like they were actually killing Americans and Iraqi soldiers. And all I found myself doing was hoping and praying, oh, please don't kill anybody, because I knew Donald Trump would retaliate.
Right.
And I guess just anything to avoid that. But what we've done in the past hasn't worked either. So I would just, again, I would defer back to what you and Jay, or especially what Jay was saying last week about we have to take a wait and see approach. I just don't know what that solution would be.
And certainly, I think we have no good solutions. It's just a matter of the least bad solution. But one other, I think, issue that really disturbs me, and this is maybe more of a meta issue, is the extent to which the administration just feels it can act unilaterally in this region, or really in any other region, when it comes to war-making powers. And, certainly even some Republicans criticized the administration's briefing. Mike Lee basically rolled his eyes and said it was, ridiculous. Yeah. And you might expect that from a Mike Lee or a Rand Paul. But, people should remember that the framers expected the power to declare war and fight wars to be a legislative power. And now the administration is justifying their actions here under the 2002 Authorization for Use of Military Force. And I'm betting most people have not read that, but I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I think it's important. I want to read one section, if you don't mind, Kristen.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's Section 3, Authorization for Use of United States Armed Forces, says the President is authorized to use the armed forces of the United States as he determines to be necessary and appropriate in order to, number one, defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq, not Iran, Iraq, and number two, enforce all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq. Mm-hmm. That is it. The entirety of the authorization section under which this was supposedly covered. That's ludicrous. That's ridiculous. The idea that this authorization done in the wake of 9/11 attacks for the invasion of Iraq has anything to do with this is just it is just ridiculous. And I think everyone understands that it is ridiculous. And so that, to me, is the bigger problem, is that Congress has once again abdicated its responsibility. And so I'm absolutely in favor of that resolution that the House passed to essentially tell the administration to get out. But to me, I would just challenge the administration's rationale. The idea that they can say that this is their legal rationale, I think is ridiculous. And so even further than that, I would argue that all further authorizations for use of military force should be sunsetted, I would say, after no more than a year, because we've seen this time and time again. I mean, the Obama administration did it, the Bush administration did it, saying, well, this covers everything. Mm-hmm. And it should, anyone, Democrat or Republican, should be concerned about just the unprecedented power that presidents have these days to wage war. And to me, this is a major consideration and a serious concern.
Well, my husband and I have been, I'll be honest, we've been arguing for 2 days over this because, as most of you probably know, Matt Gaetz, Republican representative from here in my state of Florida, though he's up in the Panhandle, he's been described as the Trumpiest president by multiple media sources. He's very much pro-Trump, in the pro-Trump camp, and he's, some would say a personal friend of Donald Trump's, and somebody who's looked at as a successor in the Republican Party in a lot of ways. He actually voted for this resolution. He was one of the few Republicans who broke ranks, and he's just being eviscerated particularly on social media. I mean, I don't really tweet much, but I lurk a lot. And, I just wanted to see what the blowback was, because when this resolution was voted for on, I believe it was Thursday, the first place I went was social media. I said, I want to see what everybody is saying about this, left, right. Is this something that's, he obviously wasn't concerned about political capital because he's in a very red district up in the Panhandle. But that night he went on, I think it was Tucker Carlson's show, and he basically explained his vote. And it was funny because I didn't know how I felt about this resolution. The reason I didn't know how I felt about it, generally I liked it because I agree with you. I think that for a long, long time, you go back several administrations, they've been sort of using these terms, war powers, they've been using them loosely. And, there's been a lot of wordplay going. I remember hearing this, within the Obama administration and cringing. And I do the same in the Trump administration, when they somehow equate like drone killings or an airstrike on Soleimani to, as something that's covered in this blanketed way by this, I think that it's something that makes me cringe no matter who is president. And so, Matt Gaetz made a principled stance, which of course angers anybody who's a partisan on, if it's your guy or your girl, making this principled stance, it angers you. And so many Republicans were just eviscerating him. And I said, no, I want to hear what he has to say. Because he is a principled guy sometimes. And so he went on Tucker Carlson and he explained, and I have to say, I get it. I told my husband and I have been arguing. I don't think he understood why he's a Republican, and he didn't understand why. And I said, well, you're looking at this through a political capital lens. If I was his campaign advisor or his campaign manager, I would be furious with him quitting right now because, this is something that doesn't look good. He's not towing the party line, blah, blah, blah. And this happens on the right and the left too. Anytime a Democrat breaks ranks, the whole Democratic Party just eviscerates them. It's the same thing. But at the same time, I listened to what he was saying, and what he was saying was sort of like what you're saying, whereas Congress should actually have a say in any sort of, whether it's we call it a confrontation, a military action, a war, they should actually have some skin in the game here. And I'm, again, I don't know if it were me, I don't know how I would have voted on this, but I get why Matt Gaetz and probably others voted the way that they did. The problem is, again, from a political standpoint, you had people in Congress. I know Chuck Schumer, who's in the Senate, but, now they're starting to talk about adding some of this stuff into the impeachment trial and, maybe bringing about new articles of impeachment with this whole, with this confrontation and some of Trump's decisions. So I feel like a lot of this, backbone of what you mentioned is getting lost. It's just getting lost with this political back and forth. It felt political, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it's time that this is something we revisit. Republicans, Democrats. Maybe we can come together on this. I don't know.
Yeah, I seriously doubt it. Aside from a few people in each party, I think we've reached most of the members of Congress in their craven cowardice have decided that they're not interested in taking the risk to support their institution because the president has become sort of a prime minister, almost like a king-like figure, and you owe your loyalty to your president, who is like I said, like a prime minister, almost like a mob boss type figure, whether it's Democrat or Republican. And you can't go against the boss because it's my president, right or wrong. And if you don't go with your president, well, then to hell with you, and we should just destroy you. And that to me is if more members of Congress on both sides aren't better people, and that it's the system that I don't blame them. It's the system we've designed that elects these people. people. Ultimately, it's our fault that we elect these spineless creatures to Congress, and too many of them are spineless creatures.
Yeah. And I guess say that I do blame them to some extent, because I do feel like there are people on both sides who take principled stances. I was actually proud of Matt Gaetz. Again, I'm not saying that I support what he said or I don't support what he said. I'm not sure yet. I think I do, based on our conversation and some of the things I was thinking during the Obama administration, some of the things I'm thinking now under the Trump administration. But I do blame people in Congress to some extent, but although we have created this system, I remember thinking this when Obama was president, and I remember thinking this when George W. Bush was president too, and I actually helped get him reelected. I worked, that was my first, one of my first jobs was working on his campaign, his reelection campaign. I feel like they've become these godlike figures, like you said, and that, if you don't toe the party line, which is essentially what the head of your party, the president, or, whoever, I guess, on the Democratic side, it would be somebody like Nancy Pelosi or, whoever is deemed the official or unofficial head of your party has said, then you're not towing the line. And sometimes, some of the greatest things have been achieved in this country by people who don't toe the line, who step out of line and say, that we do have something that's wrong here. And that's why I was proud of Matt Gaetz, because he's in a very red district. He will probably get reelected. He's like he mentioned, he's in a district that's full of military veterans. I mean, I can think of two people I know who live in his district who are military veterans, but he knew that he couldn't go home to these people, look these people in the eye and say, I didn't have skin in the game here, and I'm just gonna, like you said, abdicate my position. I'm just gonna step back and let this play out and let the president make these decisions. He felt that Congress should have skin in the game, which it should. Congress has, war power. I'll probably make a lot of party line Republicans mad by saying this, but I agree with that stance, essentially, not from a political standpoint, but probably from a policy standpoint or principle standpoint.
All right, Kristen, before we move on to our next story this week, I wanted to thank SaneBox for sponsoring today's show. And, I've been trying and really kind of failing for years to get my email under control. And so I gave SaneBox a shot, and it really transformed my inbox. And as your email comes in, SaneBox leaves only the important messages in your inbox and directs all that other distracting stuff to your Sane Later folder. And that means you know what messages to pay attention to now and what can wait. And it also has other great features like the Sane Black Hole, I love that name, where you can drag messages from those annoying senders you never want to hear from again, and Sane Reminders, which lets you know if someone hasn't replied to your email by a certain date, which I think is super useful. And best of all, you can use SaneBox with any email client or phone anywhere you check your email. So check out how SaneBox can magically remove distractions from your inbox with a free 2-week trial. And if you visit sanebox.com/politicsguys today, you can start your free trial and get a $25 credit. That's sanebox.com/politicsguys. Okay, so what's our next story this week, Kristen?
So next up is sort of the ongoing impeachment trial in the Senate saga involving President Trump, Nancy Pelosi. So we have a little bit of an update, and certainly it looks like there's going to be some movement on this issue this upcoming week. But we're still sort of in a holding pattern. We should probably talk about it. So on December 18th, and just to note, that was over 3 weeks ago, although there were some holiday weeks in there. So it's been a bit of a busy time. The House of Representatives voted in straight party line fashion, of course, you probably remember, to impeach Donald Trump for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. And after that, the often discussed articles of impeachment seemed destined to head for the other side of the Capitol in quite the ceremonial fashion. I was looking forward to seeing how that works, because I don't remember from when it happened before in my lifetime, but they actually never got there. So for the last 3 weeks, there have been a lot of questions. What's going on? What's happening? When will they get to the Senate? And everyone, even and really loudest of all, Republicans and some impatient Democrats like Dianne Feinstein, which surprised me, were left wondering, where this apparent sense of urgency among Democrats had gone. And even Trump continuously was asking the question, like, where are they? Let's get the show on the road. So we have, again, like I said, we have an update. Speaker Nancy Pelosi issued a statement yesterday, which was Friday. She said that the articles would make their way to the Senate for the trial this coming week. And she also mentioned that her part in the delay was due to setting up some favorable terms for the trial. She said she'd be meeting with Democratic House leadership. She mentioned Representative Jerry Nadler on Tuesday to discuss the procedures, how this would go, et cetera, et cetera. And to all of this, I kind of thought some of this was funny. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said about time. That was literally his statement in response. And of course, Dianne Feinstein was relieved. There were other Senate Democrats that were angered with the delay that were relieved. So I don't know. Do you think we're going to see this happen this week, Mike?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I certainly support Pelosi's gamesmanship. She ran it out as long as she could and was willing to take the heat for that. And in that interim, a number of things happened. There were some additional documents that came up because of some Freedom of Information requests. And John Bolton said that he would, in fact, testify if he were subpoenaed. I don't know that this stuff would have happened had it gone under McConnell's preferred timeline, which would have probably been a quick vote for an acquittal before Christmas. So I think Pelosi's gamesmanship, and that's what it was, did what she had reasonably hoped it could do. And of course, I found it highly amusing to hear Mitch McConnell, wringing his hands about this awful gamesmanship and playing with the rules and so forth. And I thought, oh my God, Mitch McConnell, the fact that you could say that without bursting into flames is it is pretty amusing. But yeah, I don't have a problem with it. And, I feel that it's entirely, obviously the Democrats, we didn't get exactly what we wanted. We would have liked an agreement on witnesses. And for Mitch McConnell making that, saying, well, it's good enough, it was good enough for Clinton, it's good enough here. This is a different case in that there are still key witnesses that haven't been heard from in this instance because the White House refused to let them testify. And that wasn't the case in the Clinton impeachment. So, for instance, I, for one, would really love, and I think it's important that we hear from Bolton, from Mulvaney. I'd like to hear from Giuliani, Rick Perry. Those are the four at the top of my list, and I think they would be able to shed some light, whether they, perjured themselves or not. I don't know, but I would like to hear from them. And if a case can be made, and if 51 senators agree that somehow Joe Biden should be subpoenaed, well, then I'm okay with that too. Because if this is actually a trial, which Mitch McConnell doesn't seem to think it is, just some sort of thing we need to get out of the way, but it's supposed to be a trial. They're supposed to be, weighing the evidence and reaching a conclusion, as opposed to just saying, well, of course we can't vote to convict the president. Mitch McConnell has said flat out, I'm working with the administration on this in violation of the oath I will take when this starts. He didn't say that part, but it's implied. So, to me, if it's a trial, let it be a trial. And if you can make a case that Joe Biden is an important witness, okay, fine. I'm pretty sure I can make a much better case that John Bolton is an important witness or Mick Mulvaney is. I want senators to be on the record to vote for or against those witnesses and have to be able to defend those choices.
Yeah, I actually, you took the words out of my mouth with calling Joe Biden to the stand. I thought in the beginning, when the articles of impeachment weren't making their way to the Senate, I talked about this with a lot of people, and I tried to, wrap my head around why. Because if you listen to the voices on the right, you were hearing things like, oh, there'll be some, extra stuff uncovered, and this is all political, and like you'd use the word gamesmanship. I think that's accurate, but maybe going in a different direction. Maybe this is just a ploy, and she wants to try to hit it closer to the 2020 election. I think, I guess that's possible. It just didn't seem likely to me. And then it just seemed like it, then we had the holidays, and, I thought to myself, well, maybe that's literally it. The holidays, as somebody who worked in cable news, I can tell you the holidays are a dead zone in terms of, people tuning in and watching. And, maybe she felt like, in terms of optics, because the Democrats, if nothing else, they really sort of, rule the day when it comes to optics. This would be really bad optics. But then it seemed to drag out longer, and then the optics weren't playing in their favor. There were more and more people who were being polled. And again, I don't put a ton of stock in polls because I think they're incredibly biased. But, poll after poll was coming out saying that, the sentiment of most, regular Americans was that, let's get the show on the road. There was this huge sense of urgency. I think, Nancy Pelosi was obviously feeling a lot of pressure from her base, but I think she was also feeling a lot of pressure from some of the more left-leaning members of her party, the Ocasio-Cortezes, people like that, to sort of get the show on the road. We're gonna ram this through. And from a political standpoint, I don't think this played out well for the Democrats. But that being said, there is this movement to make a motion to dismiss in the Senate. And, it's funny because I am a Republican and I understand where they're coming from, but I don't want to see that happen, because I think what would happen if you made an immediate motion to dismiss, or if this was just rammed through, or what if we went by a faster, you said Mitch McConnell's timeline, if we had gone by a faster timeline, I think the Democrats would have spun this in their favor and said, well, you rammed this through, you made a motion to dismiss, whatever, even though it probably wouldn't have passed. We need to let this play out. We need to let there be a trial. I started to think, going back to your point about Joe Biden, I started to wonder if it had to do with calling Joe Biden to the stand, because Republicans have mentioned the name Giuliani testifying, in terms of testifying, has been mentioned by Republicans. Rick Perry has been mentioned, I think, by Donald Trump himself in terms of, testifying. But I do feel like, based on the interviews that I saw, especially with like Chuck Schumer, that there was some effort to protect Joe Biden in all of this, because he is the Democratic frontrunner. I do think to some extent Pelosi's hands were tied, but like I've said before on this show, I don't agree with her, but I think she's, a smart politician, and she certainly knows how to play the game, for better or for worse. And I give her a lot of credit. I think that part of her hesitation, was to maybe see how the primary was looking. No politician goes into any of this without looking at 2020 or whatever the next election is. And I think part of that may have been an effort to protect Joe Biden, because I do think that if he's called to the stand, there will be some incredibly damning things that will come out about him. And we still don't know what happened there.
See, I disagree with that last part. Up to that part, I certainly wouldn't disagree with you, but I don't think Joe Biden has anything to I don't think there's anything going on there. I think it's very well established by the facts what Joe Biden did and didn't do in Ukraine. And so the only thing that would be damning would be the way that the facts that would be twisted and the misinformation, the outright lies that would, I am certain, accompany his testimony. And certainly that could damage him politically. But the truth will not damage Joe Biden, because in truth, Joe Biden did nothing wrong, whereas Donald Trump, it appears to me, did an awful lot wrong. Whether it's impeachable, removable, I don't know. I tend to think it is, but I don't think the truth. Joe Biden has anything to fear from the truth, just the manipulation of the truth by his opponents.
Well, I think we agree to disagree on the Joe Biden issue, but I do agree with you. Leading up to that point, that this is something that does need to take place, if only for, and I hate to go back to for political reasons, but we are all looking at 2020, and I think that I also think just both sides owe it to the American people to let this play out, and hopefully I don't know that I give Nancy Pelosi and company or Chuck Schumer and company credit for, I don't know that I would say that they will do this, but I hope that whenever it is over, that it is over, and that, Mitch McConnell lets this take place, and that, and that this, now whether or not this will happen, that means we're calling for civility in Congress. And right now it just doesn't seem very likely. I hope we have civility, and I hope we let this play out, and I hope people pay attention to it. No matter which way it goes, there'll be spin on both sides. We'll be twisting words on both sides. I mean, that's just what politicians in the media, this is what they do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Before we move on, just want to thank our latest Patreon supporters, Keith, Andrew, Matthew, and Jordan. And so thanks, guys. We really do appreciate your support. You help us keep the show going. And when you become a monthly sustaining supporter of the show through Patreon, you also get our weekly bonus show, our quick take, and a bunch of other things that we put together for supporters at all kinds of levels. To check it all out, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. And hey, if being a monthly supporter is too much of a commitment, but you just occasionally like to give us kind of a little financial attaboy, you can do that through PayPal. And there's a link there on our show page, politicsguys.com/support. Thank you so much. All right, moving on, Kristen, what do we got next?
So the next thing that you and I had talked about doing that sounded really fun, it was your idea and it was a good one, is, sort of looking back on the last 3 years. Donald Trump was inaugurated 3 years ago. I think January 20th, 2017 was his inauguration.
Yep,
so
just about 3 years. Yep.
Yeah, just about 3 years. So we're coming up on 3 years.
Feels like 3 decades to me. I gotta say.
I feel like I've gotten more gray hairs and everything else. But a lot has happened. Personally, professionally, for everybody. But of course, for us, with this podcast and everything else. But let's talk about maybe some of the things that we've learned, maybe some of the ways that maybe our minds have been changed, and some growth over the last 3 years. And I know you have a list. You had some interesting things you wanted to talk about. I made a list, so let's talk about it.
Well, I guess I remember looking back the first few months and just checking the news every day and just think, oh my God, what is he going to say or do next? Because I was so used to normal presidents. And now it's become sort of he's defined the presidency down to the point where it doesn't shock me anymore. I just sort of ignore his tweets for the most part. But I guess in a way, there were a lot of people who said this is going to be the end of the world. And so far, not quite, though. Obviously, I have concerns about pulling out of the Paris climate thing and some other things, and the Iran situation. But I think sometimes that people underestimate the resilience of our institutions, particularly the judiciary, which has in many cases withheld or stopped Donald Trump from doing some of his most questionable things. Although now, of course, as the judiciary becomes increasingly Trump appointed, that may be less of a check. And so to me, the big takeaway is about the perils of too much executive power, especially when you have an unstable, narcissistic, I don't know if he's a sociopath, but he's certainly a narcissist in office there. And certainly the framers did not envision somebody like Donald Trump as president of the United States. I mean, that's why we had an electoral college, which doesn't work, hasn't worked since the beginning. Certainly the framers never envisioned loyalty to faction over loyalty to institution to the point that we've seen. And many Republicans felt exactly the same way under Obama as a lot of we Democrats feel under Trump, though I would argue that Obama was far more of a normal or conventional president in almost any way than Donald Trump. So
he's a disruptor. I've heard
he sure
that
is.
word used a lot, for better or for worse. I mean, I guess I look at it differently, but I think it's a good word.
Yeah, you put a jackass in a barn, it's going to disrupt the barn. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, he's a disruptor. I totally agree with that. So I have some ideas, and these have kind of been brewing for a while. So Donald Trump maybe brought this to a head. But there are some things I would love to see, Kristen, and one of them is I would love to see an independently elected attorney general who would make all appointments in the Justice Department, subject to congressional approval. Because what the Trump administration has shown me is that if you are sufficiently brazen to use the Justice Department, you can use the Justice Department in all sorts of ways to cover yourself and protect yourself. And now a lot of Republicans, I recall, said exactly the same thing about, Holder and Lynch and so forth in the Obama administration. So this isn't just a partisan thing. This isn't just me being concerned about Barr and to a certain extent Sessions, though I think Sessions, although a lot worse on policy, was a lot more independent. And, like some 40 something states, I believe, have an independently elected attorney general for exactly this reason, because the administration of justice shouldn't be totally political. Things should be insulated. And I think it would be great if we had some way to independently elect an attorney general to check the excesses of both Democratic and Republican administrations who want to use the Justice Department to cover things up as opposed to go after violations of the law wherever they happen. What do you think about that? It's pretty radical, I know.
It is radical. I guess, I don't know, I'd have to kind of unpack that a little bit, but what comes to mind is, in our state of Florida, we have, I think of our state attorney general. Her name's Ashley Moody, and she's a Republican. She's a Trump supporter. She was elected in 2018. I love her personally. I've met her a few times. She's great, but she's sort of in that same vein as like Ron DeSantis, who's our governor here in Florida. And I think about the fact that until Ashley Moody, we had sort of, I would say, several like weak and ineffective attorneys general in this state. And I know that's, a common complaint from state to state. I guess I would worry about, you said you want to remove politics from the process. I would worry about, if this were something that would happen, electing an attorney general, I would worry about it becoming political from another standpoint. And that's,
that's a great point. So let me rephrase. I don't want to remove politics. I want to remove some of the power from the presidency. And to me, that's the overriding concern, is that I would think that what the last, let's say, 15 years, that's right. I had to do math in my head, and it all of a sudden made my head hurt. But what the last 15 years should tell Republicans and Democrats is that the president's too damn powerful, and Congress isn't going to do anything about it. And so certainly having an independently elected attorney general would parcel out some of that power to someone who's independently accountable to the public.
Okay.
And and kind of along those lines, I'm going to go even further than that. I would love to see an independently elected Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And how I envision this is someone who would serve a 4-year term with a 2-term limit, just like the president, who would do everything that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court now does, but would also appoint all federal judges, including other Supreme Court judges, again, subject to congressional approval. And why I think this would be incredibly important and helpful would be because it would take away I hate Trump, but, judges. So all of a sudden, that's gone. If you're concerned about judges, but you think Donald Trump is an execrable human being who does awful things, well, then great. You vote for the Chief Justice who's going to appoint conservative judges, but you don't have to vote for Donald Trump. You can vote for someone who's not insane, or something like that. So because you hear that on both sides. I mean, I felt the same way about Clinton. I was not crazy about Hillary Clinton, but I knew the kind of judges she would appoint. And that was a big deal for me. It's a big deal for people on both ends. And when you're voting for a president based more than anything else for a lot of people, I think, on judges, I think that suggests that there's a problem with the system. And again, that the president has too much power. And I want to see some of that power pulled away from the executive and given to someone else who's more independently accountable to the people.
So in this idea, and again, like I'm just kind of now unpacking it. How long would be the term? How long would the term be?
4-year term, 2-term limit. So it'd be limited just like the president. And that way it would give the people much more of a voice on the court, a much more direct voice. And I think that would be much better than having the president have one more power. And again, people say, well, the Constitution is totally against it. But remember that the framers had no inkling that the president would be anywhere close to as powerful and would be horrified with how powerful the president is. So for me, this is actually much more in keeping with the vision of the framers of a far more limited presidency.
So then this Chief Justice would appoint the other justices?
Well, I mean, if when an opening came, when there happened to be an opening, all federal judges, including.
And these judges would serve 4-year terms too? I'm just trying to get a feel.
No, the other justices would be life terms. So it'd only be the Chief Justice who would have a term and be limited and so forth. So the court would still maintain its independence, because 8 of the 9 justices would not be elected justices, only that one.
Okay. So
I think it would be best of both worlds, actually.
I think this is something that we need to discuss in a future episode, because this is a very interesting proposition. I'm finding myself coming up with questions and wondering how this would work. This is something I've never really heard much about before. So
well, and there's one other thing I wanted to mention is, and I said congressional approval for appointees, because my third thing I'd love to see is requiring all nominations, regardless of whether it's a president making them or these new positions that I envision in my fever dreams, that requiring all nominations to be approved by both the House and the Senate. And the reason why I say this is, the original idea of the framers for having the Senate and not the House give advice and consent on this is because the Senate, of course, had this greater insulation from the public, because until the 20th century, there was no direct election of senators. So this was supposed to be a check on the public. And so to me, requiring both the House and the Senate is yet another check on executive power here that we need. So you can see the theme that I'm going for here is
checks on executive power, because
Congress is demonstrated that it just lacks the backbone to do this. And so we need to create the structures, the institutional structures and processes to force the issue, because Congress isn't going to do this. And so that's why I'm proposing all 3 of these things. And again, this would be, and that in addition to, I mentioned earlier in the show, a law that would sunset all authorizations for uses of military force after 1 year, which, they can always be reapproved, as a way to redesign the structure to basically, make the president much less powerful. And I think that helps you whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, because we should all be worried about unchecked executive power. Because Congress, if you're waiting for Congress to save you from this, well, good luck, pack a sandwich, because you got a long way ahead of you.
Well, I think we definitely need to revisit this on a future episode, because I have a lot of thoughts and questions and a million things running through my head. Let me ask you quickly, is this something that you ever thought about? I mean, you said that this is something that came about more so during the last 3 years, but is this something you thought about during the election of 2016, or is it something you thought about under the Obama administration at all, or is this just something that's come about in the last 3 years? Just out of curiosity.
I think it was highlighted in the last few years. I wasn't, like a lot of Democrats, I wasn't worried about executive power under Obama, because I felt like, hey, he's doing stuff I like, So
yeah.
But the more I thought about it, the more troubled I got by. And there were some things that President Obama did that I liked, but I felt were overreaching his executive power. The DACA is probably the biggest example of that.
Yeah.
But then having a president come in who does what I think are just awful things and also abusing executive power to do that really made me think about that and made me realize that this is an issue that people who are concerned about the proper balance between the powers on both sides should be able to find common cause on. And maybe the way to do it is essentially to do it in such a way that if amendments, because of course these would take, constitutional amendments, if amendments were passed, that they would only go into effect when the next president were elected. So that way one party wouldn't say, well, you're hamstringing our guy. Well,
right.
Okay, fine. If it requires that to make it to go into effect, just say whenever the next president is elected, it'll take effect. And I'd be okay with that sacrifice for getting this safeguard in to protect us from executive power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just to sort of piggyback on what you were saying, I think there's, one thing that we can't overlook ever is bias. We bring it up again and again on the show, but I remember thinking during Obama's administration, I remember being in grad school and just spending days reading these policy papers and thinking these same thoughts, 4 or 5 years ago. That, oh my gosh, that the amount of power that this man has. And I remember thinking this about the drone strikes, which we talked about earlier. Like, how is he able to do this? This is proven time and time again to be disastrous in terms of the Constitution. And I felt like Congress was looking the other way, which angered me. And I felt like the media gave him a big pass. And, and now it's funny because now Trump's in office. In the last 3 years, I voted for Trump. I support some of what he does. I don't support everything he does, and I don't agree with it. But I feel like in order to be fair, we have to look at it through. We have to remove bias as much as possible. And I think I think these are interesting propositions that the presidency has gotten too big. It has, presidents have become too powerful. And that is something I thought about more so during Obama's time in office. But again, like I can't just pretend like it disappeared with Donald Trump, which is what I think partisan people tend to do, going either way. I think this is something we have to keep talking about, no matter who reveals this to you, Trump or Obama, whoever will be next,
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. I mean, it's going to come back to bite you. Even if you're happy with Trump now, eventually there's going to be another president who you do not like, whose policies you don't like. So, and for those people who carry the little pocket constitutions with them and revere it like it's, I don't know, like Moses carried it down right after the 10 Commandments or something, I should say, think about what the framers were trying to do, and think about how far and how far we've strayed from that. And so if you're truly concerned about what the framers had in mind for us, then you should embrace methods to ensure that the president is not this quasi-dictator type of person that he's become, essentially. I win 4 years and I get to do whatever the hell I want for these 4 years, and Congress is not going to stop me because it doesn't have the spine to stop me. And so that should concern especially people who revere the framers and what they were trying to do in this country. All right. Well, as you can tell, I am very passionate about these issues, and maybe we should try to do a separate show just to talk about that.
Oh, yeah.
Could, get on my soapbox for even longer. But I guess that does it for this show, but doesn't do it for us entirely, because of course, as soon as we're done recording this, we will be recording our bonus show, and that's just for Patreon supporters. And of course, we also have our weekly quick take. I think Jay's doing it this week. And finally, Patreon supporters also get ad-free versions of every episode of the show. And to find out more about all that stuff, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. If you want to get in touch with us for whatever reason, you can do that at mail@politicsguys.com. Check out our Bipartisan Politics subreddit, which has some great discussions, and that's on Reddit at, Bipartisan Politics, and also our Facebook page where we post all kinds of stuff, facebook.com/politicsguys page, and we are on Twitter at politicsguys. If you haven't already, we would really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the show, leave ratings and reviews, and most especially share your favorite episodes on social media or, email if you're old school, or both. What the hell? The executive producers of the Politics Guys, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, and Daniel Toe. Today's show is produced by Krista Matheny and Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.